You're about to watch a recorded session from a live event brought to you by Lower Street, a podcast agency for brands. For more recordings like this or for information on other podcast events we have coming up, head to lowerstreet.co/events.
Today's guest on Office Hours is Jeremy Enns, the founder of the Podcast Marketing Academy and the writer of the Scrappy podcasting newsletter. So we'll leave all the details in the follow-up afterwards, so you can sign up to the email and follow Jeremy. And today, Jeremy is going to share some findings about podcast packaging, demonstrating how an update in the artwork and title led to a 45% listener growth and increase to a podcast, which really excited to see. And after Jeremy's presentation, we'll come back and have a bit of a Q&A with Jeremy. So please leave your questions in the chat. And also at the end, we'll be announcing the winners of a giveaway. And we're going to be giving away 3 copies of Jeremy's perfect podcast packaging workshop. So stay tuned to hear the winners of that. And yeah, with that, I will pass over to you, Jeremy.
Great. Yeah. Well, first off, thanks so much for having me. I always love the interactions that I have with everyone on the Lower Street team. I don't think I've met everybody yet. You guys have quite the big team, but everybody is absolutely lovely. So I'm very excited to be doing this workshop here today. Packaging, let's kind of get a definition out of the way first here. And so essentially when we're talking about podcast packaging, we're kind of looking at the external kind of touch points that somebody has before they start engaging with the show. And so some of those big things are going to be cover art, show title. Those are probably the 2 biggest kind of packaging touch points. And then we can also look at episode titles, show descriptions, and sometimes you could even extend that onto, the music and the kind of like branding of the show itself. And so that's kind of what we're talking about here when we are talking about show packaging. Okay, before we dive in here, I would be curious in the chat to put on a scale of 1 to 10, with that kind of definition of your show's packaging, how well do you think you compare to other shows in your space? And so 5 would be kind of, yeah, pretty comparable in terms of, design, cover art, things like that. 10 is like way better than the other shows in your space. 1 is way worse than other shows in your space. Where is everybody kind of at on that scale of 1 to 10? And feel free to just drop that in the chat. We got a 4, 6. Oh, Doug, good to see you. 6, 7, 4. Okay. We've got lots kind of in that middle territory. And I would say, yeah, that's probably where, a lot of shows are. And so we're going to look at, I'll actually be curious to get your opinion on something coming up here on using this kind of same scale potentially. All right, so let's kick things off here. And we are going to be digging into a case study here. And so the case study in question is a show called the Growth Mindset Podcast, or at least it was a little while ago. There's a slight tweak, which we'll talk about here, that was made. But this is a show that's been active since 2017. It's produced over 350 episodes, top 0.5 on listen notes, and averaging 30,000 downloads a month. So, by all accounts, a pretty successful show already. One thing to note that is interesting with shows with extensive back catalogs like this, that 30K downloads a month, like new episodes get way fewer downloads than you might think, because back catalog episodes tend to make up for a pretty significant amount a lot of times. And this is true for most shows with really large back catalogs. So that said, still a pretty successful show. The host is a guy who you might have heard of, but it's actually a different guy. His name is Sam Harris, but it's not that Sam Harris. Yet there is a more famous Sam Harris. And then there's the Growth Mindset Sam Harris, who's from the UK. And is not the kind of, I don't even know what you would call the other Sam Harris, how you would define him, but kind of one of the biggest names in podcasting and, philosophy and a whole bunch of other fields. And so that is something that Sam and I have had many conversations about. Has this kind of name overlap worked for him or against him? He actually thinks it's worked against him. And he's got a lot of negative reviews where people basically think he's trying to steal the other Sam Harris's identity. So anyway, this whole side quest here, but Sam Harris is the host of the Growth Mindset Podcast. Been doing this a while, and we started working together about a year ago after kind of knowing each other for a few years before that. And so I mentioned I wanted to get your opinion on something here using that same kind of 1 to 10 scale. Sam had achieved all of this at this point, so pretty successful show with this cover art. And so he was 7 years in. This was his cover art. What's the rating out of 10 here that people would give? And I'd also be curious to know if you wrote down something, first word that comes to mind when you see this cover art. Feel free to do first 1 or 2 words. What comes to mind when you see this? First gut reaction. Birthday lima bean. Okay. 8. Okay, Tom's okay. Generous. 6. Simplistic. Okay, childlike. Childlike's an interesting one in multiple ways. We might talk about that later. Word podcast is not necessary. 3 pills. Canva. Boring. Basic. Adolescent. 3, 3, 4. Okay, so I see we are pretty in alignment here on some of the opinions around the cover art. And it turns out that Sam actually was also in agreement with this, and he had just kind of not really prioritized it, and the show had happened to grow almost to his perspective and mine as well, kind of in spite of the cover art. And so after I did an audit of his show, listened through a bunch of episodes, went through all the packaging, did a big report for him. I had kind of I had known Sam for a couple years before this, and I was always kind of like, we didn't know each other well enough that I felt like was comfortable saying like, dude, like, what's the deal with the cover art here? Like, I know you got a really successful show, but like, I think this could be improved. And at this point, he'd actually hired me for my actual unvarnished feedback, as brutally honest and blunt as possible. And so we talked about the cover art. And so after I'd given him, my feedback, he had kind of known that this was coming. I gave him some suggestions on maybe some things he could do to start. It also turns out that at this point, his now partner, girlfriend, is a designer. And so he had her in his ear as well, who was also telling him, hey, Sam, what's the deal with the artwork here? And so he was ready to up-level the show. At this point, he was actually now doing the show as a full-time gig. And so that he was a professional podcaster, one of the rare few in the world. But it's not necessarily, you need a lot of downloads to be really doing super well as a professional podcaster. And so he's looking to kind of improve the quality of every touch point and further grow the show to bring in more sponsors and advertisers. So he went into the ideation and concept development phase. And so he did this right in some ways, maybe not in other ways. We'll look at that in a second here, but we can see some things here. If we zoom in over here, he was going through a lot of different kind of like typeface iterations, logo iterations, exploring a whole bunch of different ways to think about the visual kind of typography of the show. He's clearly got some influences here that he's pulling in, some notes that he's adding around some of these other shows that he feels like he might be in overlapping categories with to some extent. We have a bunch of photo shoot ideas that he's got going on here. I think hundreds of photos probably. He started marking some of the ones. We've got some interesting ones that he didn't go with. We've got mock-ups here where he's taking some of these other shows that might, his show might appear alongside, and looking how does the show fit in alongside those. And we see a lot of obvious trends here where it kind of feels reminiscent of maybe Daily Stoic, certainly Mark Manson, Diary of a CEO. So we've got there's certainly some vibes going on here. We've got some other kind of concepts that were being played with. I actually think this one's kind of interesting on the top. It's very distinctive, but didn't end up going with that. A couple other ones here. And so basically we got some, mock-up stuff like that. So he did this, rigorously. He went through this process and he ultimately came away with this concept. And so the concept here is, very much like we see with a lot of shows nowadays, in the kind of, I would say, like self-development kind of tech space to some extent, maybe marketing, which is kind of where Sam's show was. Maybe not 100%, but a lot of the shows I think that he listens to were along these lines. He actually liked these two designs more on the right with this kind of typography here. I kind of like this middle one. It feels kind of interesting and different to me. But the network that he's on, they like this one on the left. They kind of pushed him towards that, said it's more readable. And so he ended up going with this one, even though he didn't feel like this was necessarily his personal favorite. So he rolled out the cover art, and let's see here. Do I got the... Oh, I thought I had the drum roll. We had the wrong sound effect here. Anyway, okay. So the result, it was not all that good. Within the first month, his Spotify impressions had about halved, and his downloads in Spotify here, which he shared his dashboard, also were dropping off. And so we can see there was an upward trajectory for a long time leading up to this in the previous few months. And then basically he negated all of that growth in 1 month following that after rolling out the artwork. And so this is obviously not necessarily the way that you want your cover art redesign to go. And I'm curious if anybody has any ideas on what you think might be some of the issues that caused a decrease in downloads after this cover art, this initial redesign. Feel free to throw those in the chat and see if there's anything that that comes up here. Lack of recognition from former listeners. Yes, I think that is certainly in play here. Just like everyone else. Ooh, okay. A couple of sharp points already here that I would agree with both of those. Loss of brand awareness. Yep, would also agree with that. It is worth noting that he did start seeding that cover art in his episode-specific artwork in the month or so leading up to actually changing the show over. So he was trying to offset that and get that in front of people immediately, but or earlier, but it didn't work. Not distinctive enough, not very eye-catching, stands out. Yes. Okay, so that would be my assessment on a lot of this too. I would say that it is vastly more legitimate than his existing show. And so it looks much more professional, much more legitimate, much stronger first impression when you come across it, but it was at the expense of some of these other things that you everybody here mentioned. And some of this is due to existing listeners maybe not recognizing the show, and other, it might be off-putting or whatever, not attracting the right new listeners. So essentially, after a month of running with this this new cover art and seeing the impact on his the negative trajectory of growth, let's say, he reverted back to his old cover art and he said, okay, let's move on from that experiment. Fortunately, his downloads and everything kind of reverted to the previous level. So he ran with a new cover art for a month. And after that, he reverted back, and then everything kind of just went back to where it was, which is a kind of interesting little side narrative here as well. So he was doing a kind of post-mortem on this cover art redesign, and some of the things that he recognized immediately were that he actually had a lot of confirmation bias here. And so he was talking to people about the new design as he was going through it, but they were all his friends and his peers and people who listened to shows like him, but didn't necessarily listen to his show. And so he was getting the show in front of people, or the artwork in front of people who listened to other shows like, Mark Manson's or Diary of a CEO, or some of these other ones, Ryan Holiday's, like some of these shows that he was kind of drawing some inspiration off of, and maybe wanted to feel like he fit in that category with. People were like, great, yeah, looks professional, looks, really slick, whatever. But he did not actually talk to any listeners of his show, which was potentially problematic. He also noted late after the fact that he got this cover art in front of a couple of female friends who made comments like, yeah, it looks kind of intimidating. It's kind of off-putting, especially as a woman. And he said, oh, no, that's just like that one friend. Like, I don't think, that it's that big a deal. In hindsight, he's like, yep, that was probably 100% accurate. The other thing to note here is, he's going to this cover art here from this one where, a lot of his listeners probably have no idea what he looks like, and just a drastically different style from this one, where this one that somebody mentioned childlike before, that has, can have both good and negative connotations. And I think the show has a certain kind of childlikeness to it in terms of some of the humor that he kind of like dry humor and little stories that he puts into these conversations about like growth mindset and psychology and things like that. This one just does not feel anything like that. It does not feel approachable in the same way. It does not feel lighthearted, and it feels much more like a lot of the shows that, as he found out later, his audience actually was repelled by. And so looking at some of these other shows that we think about, I think Diary of a CEO, Mark Manson, Ryan Holiday, some of these shows, nothing against them, but his audience had often listened to those, he found out later from doing some research, and was put off by them. And that's actually what they liked about Sam's show, was that it was a refreshing alternative to some of those. But you look at this cover art and you do not necessarily get that it's going to be different from. So he moved on. The other thing, as people mentioned here, the change was probably too drastic, and so it didn't kind of people probably didn't recognize it in the feed, and also it was just like such a big change in vibe. And then, like I kind of just mentioned here, the cover art didn't really match the show vibe and what people loved about the show, which at this point he didn't really know. So his next steps were to actually talk to listeners and understand their kind of personal experience and associations with the show. And what he found was that a lot of people, kind of like I just mentioned, had listened to all these self-help podcasts in the past and often felt like they were just being like told to like pull themselves up by their bootstraps and like just like figure it out. And a lot of people complained about that, and they're like, yeah, I don't like these shows. Like they're off-putting to me. I listen to all these, podcasts, all these self-help books, and it's just like I don't like the vibe. Your show feels like it's getting me to the same result without treating it the same way. And I really like that about it. And it takes this more kind of scientific, psychologically based perspective rather than this more maybe pure self-help based perspective. And so he decided one of the things that came out of our audit as well was that he wanted to look at kind of tightening up the show concept as a whole. And he's somebody who has like a lot of creative ideas and has a lot of he's kind of like me, where if we had the bandwidth, we would just each be creating 10 shows at a time. And so he was looking to maybe go with, and maybe like a lot of people here too, but he was looking to tighten up the show concept. And so he's going to saying like, okay, let's do some minor changes to the artwork right now. Like that rebrand didn't work, but the current artwork still isn't ideal. There are still some problems with it that I think we can do some minor upgrades to still get it better while we figure out, okay, what is the potentially new, tighter show concept? And then we're going to do a rebrand around that. So what he ended up with was this. It seems on the surface like quite a subtle upgrade, but I'd actually be curious to hear, when you're looking at this now, what would you say about the artwork on the right here versus the one on the left? Kind of first impressions comparing these two, or anything that stands out. Feel free to shout that out as well. Off-white always feels better. Polished, and I know that what I'm going to get. Yep, stronger font, much better font, more sophisticated blue. Ooh, sophisticated blue. I like that. Psychology. Oh, hey, Eric, good to see you here. Psychology makes me think more academic. Word psychology actually said something about the show where podcast didn't. Thank God he dropped the word podcast. That is a lightning round topic. I'm with everybody on that front here too. Yeah, so this is basically, I agree with all of that. And this was some of the stuff that I kind of mentioned in the audit. I am never a fan of white backgrounds. And the reason I think is that, it's a problem when it shows up on a background like this, where you don't know what the framing of the artwork is. And so your brain is kind of trying to figure out what's going on here, especially when you're expecting a square, like most podcast players, where this just feels less professional. We don't have that framing that gives it the proper dimension. And so sometimes what you can do is you can put a just frame around the edge of it, like a border, or going with an off-white. And I really like this off-white feels kind of warm and approachable. It's almost paper-like. There's something that I really like about this. The coloring, both the blue and the green, and as well the microphone stands out a bit better here. Here he's got 2 shades of green. This, I'm still not the biggest fan of podcast related imagery in cover art, but for the minor update here, this I think works. And then yeah, the font is super strong and compared to certainly the previous one here. And so all these kind of minor, very minor changes based on the same design actually immediately give you a much more legitimate and more modern kind of first impression here, where this one on the left feels like something that's maybe like, early 2000s kind of online design. And this one feels like something that actually feels intentional. It feels like it belongs. It feels like it was designed, with purpose. Whereas this one feels kind of accidental by somebody who I think he did this himself. We can even see like the growth mindset doesn't align perfectly with the circle around it. It doesn't kind of stick with that arc of it, whereas this one does. And so there's all these kind of very minor things that actually add up to our first impression of the show, that whether or not people realize it and whether or not our listeners are professional designers, like that is saying something about the show. And so this is a kind of fascinating kind of minor tweak that has a big difference. A couple other things that I'll point out that I notice here. Some of the things that Sam noted was basically amateur designers. I've certainly been in this camp for a long time. Want to put like drop shadows on everything. I think it just like feels designy. It feels like you're doing something. And it is just never a good idea. So drop shadows, not a good idea. Got rid of those. Current kind of design trends are much flatter as well. Anyway, the color updates. And then somebody mentioned the word podcast to psychology. And I think Eric called this out, where yes, I think Sam had actually changed the name in the podcast apps to Growth Mindset Psychology about a month earlier. But this was then when he updated on the cover art. And to me, these are just two vastly different shows. When I think of Growth Mindset Podcast versus Growth Mindset Psychology, yeah, it feels way more scientific, way more academic. And one of the things that Sam was trying to do with the cover art redesign, but also with his show description, topic selection, all these things, was position the show, shift the positioning more towards the academic scientific side of things, where he didn't want to be attracting people who were more into like the woo-woo side of things. And he's like, I don't have a problem with that, but that's not what the show's about. And I really want this show to feel grounded in science and psychology. And he does a lot of like academic research for the show, even though he's not an academic himself. And so part of the goal of the show for him is to like just personally get smarter about all these topics and then share those with his listeners. And so I think that change from growth mindset podcast to growth mindset psychology, one word, has a huge difference on the perception of the show. And I saw a couple people point that out here as well. One other thing, this is totally random, but I think it's something that may, who knows, play some role in, what's ever going on in our brains. When I look at this initially, when I come across it, there's something that evokes the globe a little bit, the green and the blue with the oceans and the land. I'm kind of like, there's something that evokes this kind of like globalness or something, even though it's not what's actually in the design, but my brain there's an echo of it there, which who knows if that does anything for anybody, but that's something that stood out to me when I kind of saw this cover up for the first time. All right, so made the artwork change and rolled it out again. And this time was a bit of a different story here. And so before the artwork change right around here, he was bringing in around maybe 250 new Apple Podcast followers per week. And so that's 250 new people following the show every week. And over the next couple months here, maybe 2.5 months or so, he was up to close to 600. And he actually kind of accelerated that beyond that. So bringing in a lot of new people on a consistent basis. Cover art was changed. That title tweak had been made at the show level before and was maybe having some effect already. Now was also on the cover art. And the other thing to note here is he was also working on his episode titles with something. So there's a few things that were at play here, but the big obvious one was the cover art. The other thing that I'll note too is he actually went down from 3 episodes a week to 2 episodes a week in the same time span. So there's like a bunch of stuff changing. And so he was still actually growing quite a bit while actually producing fewer episodes at this point, only 2/3 as many. So that is an interesting addition. So new followers are growing. That is fantastic. If we look at his download numbers here, and so we're looking, here's 2024. This right around here is probably where he made the cover art change. And we can see a huge increase in monthly downloads across the whole show after that. And this actually kept growing. He's now over 100,000 downloads a month in just Apple Podcasts. And so it's had a huge effect here. And so this is Apple Podcasts. If we look at some of the other platforms here, so he went from 37,000 around kind of downloads kind of right before this to 100,000 downloads in Apple per month in 3 months. Another interesting note here is he actually reactivated 2,000 existing subscribers. And so there's about 2,000 new people who discovered the show, but his kind of number of people who listened the last month actually went up by an additional 2,000. And so were these people who were they'd subscribed to the show, but had kind of like churned or were stopped listening. They were kind of dormant, who when he made the change, those 2,000 people actually started listening to the show again more regularly, which is fascinating. On Spotify, he went from 16,000 impressions a day to 25,000 and had 30% daily download growth within about a month. He sent me some updates on the Apple stats, not on some of the other platforms, which is why some of these are 3 months, some of these are 1 month. And so he was around, I think, like 600 to 650 downloads a day in Spotify across the whole catalog before, and he was up to 850 or something like that after. And then across all kind of from his hosting platform on Megaphone, he was at around 6,000 downloads an episode before, and went up to 8,000 downloads an episode within 1 month, and that's continued to grow as well. And an interesting point, the show, you look at all the distribution platforms that your show is on, basically it grew after the artwork change. Every single platform except 2, one of which was Firefox, and the other one was some kind of JavaScript something. So those are, minor, very minor platforms. And so it was very pronounced in Apple and Spotify, but it was also a thing in other platforms. And one of the things that he has kind of like pointed out from monitoring his download numbers and everything is like he's very keyed into the Spotify side of things. And one of the things that stood out to him has been that Spotify is so much more algorithmic than the other platforms. And so he suspects that his impressions went up because he now had a better, higher click-through rate on people who saw the show. And so that told Spotify, oh, people are clicking on the show, let's show it to more people. And so that's why Spotify was then boosting the show further, which we now have as of the past couple of weeks, a whole actual dashboard in Spotify to be able to look at our click-through rates, which I'll kind of briefly mention coming up in a little bit as well. All right. So what do we take away from this? So the one thing that I want to point out is that Sam had a huge impact here, adding, 2,000 downloads an episode, growing by huge percentages, because he already had a really quality show. Like there's a huge disconnect between the quality of his cover art and the quality of his show. He already had a lot of impressions in Spotify, and so people were seeing the show, but they weren't clicking through. And so these are two things that are kind of, it's not to say that like every show, just you upgrade your cover art and you're immediately going to see that kind of growth. I think over time it will compound into much more growth, but it's not going to see like 2,000 extra, downloads an episode if you don't have some of these kind of unique situations that Sam had. Somebody in my community kind of mentioned this. They were kind of like, I don't get it. This seems like such a small change. How did it have this impact? And we were kind of talking through it as a group. And then Sam had this quote where he was saying like, yeah, a cover art redesign, it might not double your downloads, but it's very likely even that a bad cover art on a good show could be halving them. And so maybe cover art change isn't going to double them, but it could be halving them. So maybe it's like kind of this weird kind of inverted way of thinking about it. But I think that this is actually really accurate. If you have a really great show and you're getting eyeballs on it, but the cover art is not great or the packaging is not great, there's a good chance that it is being kind of throttled back. All right, so I want to talk about a few kind of core principles here to think about with packaging, relevance, legitimacy, and distinctiveness here. And so these apply to cover art, titles, episode titles, kind of everything around the show. So when it comes to relevance, the worst thing that can happen is that our ideal listener comes across the show and doesn't know that it's for them. And so essentially, we want to make sure that one of our ideal listeners, they catch sight of our cover art and title out of the corner of their eye, and they're like, wait, what was that? Was that something that's relevant to me? And so we want to prioritize clarity kind of above all else. You can kind of like play with this to a little bit. I often think about clarity and evocativeness and thinking about, okay, we need to have a balance between these two things where clarity is telling it who it's for and what it's about. And evocativeness is more about like the vibe of the show and kind of insinuating what it might be like. So there's room for both of those, but this is the most important thing is if it's relevant, that's going to catch people's eye and pull them in for a second look. So we want cover art that is clean, uncluttered, easily readable. On the legitimacy front, this is essentially, a way of thinking about like when somebody looks at the show, are they immediately like, this looks like it's going to be worth my time. This signals that care and craft has gone into the show, that all the details of the show have been, intentionally designed. And so if we do that, we're going to get more people actually clicking into the show, more people listening. And this is one of the things where there is just so much content available that if people even have a sliver of a doubt that like, the cover art and title feel kind of like awkward or clunky, like, oh, here's another show that looks much more legitimate. I'm just going to test that one out instead. And so if your show feels amateurish in any way from the outside, it is a safe assumption that you are losing out on listeners, and that is something that you'll want to address. So with that in mind, I think that hiring a professional designer is one of the single best investments you can possibly make on the show, because there is almost no person who will ever listen to an episode without first looking at the cover art. And that cover art is going to, even if they look at it for half a second, there is something that it's communicating to them, and it is setting the tone for the show and setting kind of their expectations about what they're going to get. And so they might be skeptical or they might be excited based on the cover art going in and anticipatory in looking forward to the show. And so working with a good designer is money well spent. And the great thing about this is it's not an ongoing investment. You can if you get a great design once and you spend a few $100s, $1,000, whatever it is, that's like one investment that you made that's not going to serve you for, probably many years. And then the third piece here is distinctiveness. And so people notice pattern interrupters. This was something that a lot of people mentioned in the chat here, where with the original cover art redesign, it kind of blended in with a lot of the other shows. And Sam, I mean, he actually does have a famous name, but he's not that Sam Harris. And then when you look at the cover, he doesn't have the facial recognition of that Sam Harris. And so it doesn't really work for him to go with that style of cover art. Whereas when you're looking at, somebody like Mark Manson or Ryan Holiday, it's like, yeah, you recognize the person, they have a level of fame around them. And so you actually want that on the cover. Whereas for people who don't have that, it's not really of service to the show. So his current cover art, though, or original and the updated version, actually is a pattern disruptor. And so it stands out when people are first looking at a group of shows, gets them to take a second look. And then the other thing about distinctive kind of show assets in general is that they help with memorability. And so things that stand out, not only do they attract your attention in the moment, but they also are more memorable in the long run. And that's going to be more likely then for them to remember the show and recommend it to a friend who might match the kind of target kind of ideal listener of the show. So there's a couple of benefits of having distinctive show packaging there. And going back to this idea of distinctiveness here, we can see now in some of these same kind of mock-ups here, there's no other artwork. Obviously, this is somewhat of a curated selection here of artwork, but he was looking at some of the shows that he might fit in alongside. There's nothing else quite like his, which is interesting. So it certainly stands out, and it's a very different vibe from a lot of these. All right. One of the last things I want to move on to here, I run a report every year called the Podcast Marketing Trends Report. The next one's going to be coming out hopefully in the next few weeks. And one of the things that I was looking at this year and crunching the data on actually just over the weekend was looking at cover art and trying to kind of bring some quantitative data to it. And so essentially we divided the shows that submitted. There was about 220 shows that submitted their full 12-month download data for every month over the previous year. And basically I looked at those and said, okay, what are the shows? The high growth shows are the ones that doubled or more in size. The mid growth shows were the shows that were between the median annual growth rate, which was 18% growth, and the doubling, so 18 to 100% growth. And then the low growth were the shows that were less than 18% or 0 to 18%. So they did grow, but not, but they kind of underperformed the typical median growth rate. There was another category of shows that shrunk. Usually that's actually very big, long running shows that shrink for various reasons. So they're not really worth talking about here so much. And what I found kind of confirmed a lot of the things I suspected, but it was interesting to look into regardless. And so the first thing I looked at was clarity. And so if you look at the cover art, can you tell what the show is about? And the high growth shows and the mid growth shows, 68%, almost 70%, you could tell from the cover art what the show is about. Of the low growth shows, only 36% could you tell. In terms of legitimacy, I'll admit this is entirely subjective of me looking at the cover art and thinking, does this look legitimate to me? First reaction. And so, you know, I think I have decent design taste. And so we're going to run with that. Somebody else can take issue with that. It's a little bit subjective to each person. But at least from my perspective, the high growth shows, 64% of them felt immediately legitimate, which is, I was actually surprised it wasn't 100%. So some shows do grow, as I guess Sam's showed is kind of an example of, even despite not great cover art. But then the mid growth and low growth shows were, you know, almost 20% lower in terms of legitimacy. Less than half of them felt immediately legitimate. And then this one was actually quite surprising to me in a way and also not. But of the high growth shows, only 28% of them had the host's photo on the cover art. And of the mid growth shows, only 21%. And then the low growth shows, more than half of them had the host photo on the cover art, which is a little bit fascinating. So I've got a bunch more stuff that I'm going to be including in, if not the initial report, then in a follow-up report on both cover art and show titling that I'm quite excited to dig into the data further. And I think that there's lots of interesting stuff that we'll be able to pull out of that. All right, so that is it for the case study and some of the takeaways here in terms of packaging. If you are interested, my co-host Justin Jackson, who's the founder of Transistor.fm, we do weekly podcast roasts where we basically run through the listener experience. We kind of put ourselves in the shoes of what would a listener experience going through this show for the first time, break down title, cover art, description, episode titles, first minutes of episodes. You can find those on YouTube. And then here's the podcast marketing trends report. And also we have a kind of follow-on podcast Marketing Trends Explained, and then the Scrappy Podcasting newsletter, which Hannah mentioned at the start. All of those are at podcastmarketingacademy.com, and you can find them on the page there. If you want to go deeper into the wide and nerdy world of podcast marketing that I kind of spend my days in. So I hope that this has been helpful, and I'm guessing that people are going to have some questions, and I would love to dive into all of this.
Yeah, thank you so much, Jeremy. I can't wait for the report that you're doing. Because I feel like in the UK, especially, like we are seeing all of the podcasts kind of move towards having the host photos on there, even new shows I've noticed, which is like, yeah, I'm finding that fascinating. What do you think about that? Is it kind of like a trend in podcasting that kind of people are seeing everyone do it, so following suit in that sense?
Yeah, I think my assessment would be that people see this is like one of the biggest problems in marketing is that we tend to emulate people who are very successful, but what we don't realize is they have all these inbuilt advantages that we don't have. And so it is totally pointless to copy the marketing of somebody who's famous, because they benefit so much from their fame that it actually, there's an inversion that often happens where like it is more of a flex for them to do the opposite of actual good advice, because they can show what it's signaling is like, hey, I'm past that already. And so this is why you see Twitter profiles with like millions of followers with like a 1-word bio that is like something cryptic. And it's like that actually is beneficial to them at that stage, but it is totally detrimental to anybody else when you're trying to like build your initial following. And so I think same with cover art. It's like we look at shows that we love, and this extends to everything. It extends to show format. It extends to like show concept. All of these things. It's like we often as consumers, we're like, I love that show, and so I'm going to create a show like that. But we don't realize that it works for very specific reasons, that and there's certain dynamics at play that we don't have working for us, and so it's not usually helpful. And I think cover art is one of those.
Yeah, super interesting. Yeah, I can't wait for that report. And just thinking about the people on this call and the podcast that they might have, how would they kind of judge whether or not it's the artwork that they need to change?
Yeah. So actually, I want to I was gonna share this here. So Spotify rolled out. I wonder if I can. Do I even have this up here? And I can just share. I think I do. Okay, so I'm going to pull up my show that is in between seasons and getting many downloads right now. But let's pull it up here. And so Spotify rolled out this new analytics dashboard in the past few weeks, depending on who you are. They rolled it out at different times. And so essentially now we actually get to see what the issues are. And so here we can see 324 people. Spotify showed my show to 324 people within the past month. This is unique people. This is not views. Impressions are down here. And so we can kind of add those up and then see how many times on average did Spotify show my show to these 324 people. Then we have people who showed interest. And so Spotify defines this here as the number of people who have either gone to your podcast page, an episode page, added your episode to a playlist, followed your podcast, or played an episode more than 0 seconds. And so people have taken some action with the show. And then on the right here, we've got people who listened to an episode more than 60 seconds, which is what Spotify qualifies as a stream. And so here we can actually see what the issues might be. And so if we're seeing that, okay, a lot of people are being shown the show, but not many people are clicking through, which, you know, it's always going to be a pretty small percentage. Then it's like, okay, well, why might somebody not be clicking through? It's the title or the cover art. If that's what they're seeing and they're deciding not to click based on those, then Spotify has some reason to think this person would be interested in the show. They're not clicking through on it, so there must be some disconnect. Either Spotify's algorithm is off or my packaging is off. The second thing here, people who engage with the show, but who maybe it's a low number of people who streamed, that would much be more around like the packaging is misaligned with the content, where somebody might click into the show, then they'll read the description or they look at the episode titles and they're like, oh, this is actually isn't what I thought it was. Or they click play on an episode and they listen less than 60 seconds. And so they're saying like, ooh, this audio is really bad. Or there's something about the show that is a turn off immediately and they don't make it to 60 seconds. And so this is like super useful. My beef with this, I mean, I assume they'll get to this eventually, is that it's not really helpful in determining what are good numbers. And so I actually just yesterday whipped up this page that I have somewhere. What am I trying to take a screenshot here? Let me see. Here we go. So I'll put this in the chat as well. And so I am manually updating numbers, getting people to submit their screenshots of their Spotify analytics dashboards. You can, if you go to this page, you can add yours here. It's just like a 2-question survey, upload the screenshot and include your show link if you want. And then I'm updating the numbers here. And so far, based on like a couple dozen responses, we're seeing that the impression to interest conversion rate is 10.1%, and the kind of interest, people who engage with the show and then go on to listen, is 64%. And I'll be fascinated to see, you know, what shows up over time here. And so this, I think, then you can say, hey, if I'm way below 10%, if I'm at like 2% conversion rate, that's a clear signal that, okay, there is something wrong with my packaging that I really need to work on that. And then you can look at, you know, some of the other aspects of it here. And I've included some resources here about like, you know, here's some reasons what might be wrong if you're having a low conversion rate on the impression to interest, or here's some reasons of what might be wrong with low interest to stream. And then I've got some like blog posts and stuff to address each of those. So I'll be kind of updating this page over time as more data comes in.
Yeah, that would have been the perfect tool to have when you were testing it on episode artwork for a month, like month by month, or with each episode, because you can go into the funnel per episode as well, which is, yeah, I do love that. I'm excited to see where it's going to go. We've got a couple of questions from the audience I'm going to take. So Andrew has asked, what kind of would you recommend updating the artwork for each season of a seasonal show to make it specific to the season's theme?
I am wary of this. I would update episode artwork probably, almost certainly, as long as it's still on brand with the general kind of like theme of the show and the branding of the show. I would make maybe very minor updates to the main show artwork for seasonal shows. And I just think like there's so much that gets communicated visually in such a short amount of time, of like when you're just scrolling through your feed and you don't recognize a show in it, like normally your thumb would stop on that, and it's like it just doesn't if it's drastically different. So if you're going to do that, I would make minor changes that are still like it's very clear that this is still the same show.
Yeah, I would agree with you there. Cool. We've got another question from Anonymous. So when you make major changes on a podcast, how much should you kind of call it out and make a change visible to your audience rather than kind of just doing it and not acknowledging it?
Yeah, I think it depends on the change. I think some things maybe you do start rolling out like and testing a little bit in the background without making a big deal about it, especially if you're kind of doing some experimenting and you're not quite sure if you're going to run with it, or you just want to gauge if there's any organic feedback. I actually, even with experiments, I sometimes will call it out because I want to get a reaction, and sometimes people don't know that you're experimenting or that you want feedback. And if you can say, hey, I'm going to be trying a couple new formats over the next month, and so like I'd really love to know, like if you notice anything that stands out as particularly good or bad, like then I would even prompt that. But I think for big changes like show title change, rebrand, big cover art rebrand, I would message that stuff regularly. And I would probably, if you have dynamic ad insertion, that's a great way that you don't need to bake it into the show, and you can kind of like mention that either in the pre-roll or the post-roll or something like that, to message that. And I mean, across social media, I would make a pretty big deal. And the other reason for this is usually branding is a byproduct of some other internal shift. And so maybe the content is shifting, maybe your interests are shifting in some way. And a lot of times, or it could just be a increase in professionalism or legitimacy, or like you're bringing more focus to this thing. And I think a lot of times, like we want to make use of that to indicate to people who might be like, our show's at the periphery for them, but it's like, they're going to pay attention if, hey, we're actually changing direction that's now more aligned with where those people are. The more noise we make, the more they're going to be like, oh, Jeremy's doing something different with the show. Actually, I never really liked the old show, or it was kind of a, I listened once a month, but this new one is actually much more relevant to me. And so I actually want to listen to this. And so that would, regardless of what's bringing on the change, I think it is worth talking about it, and also talking about the backstory of like why we're doing this change.
Yeah, because I think that was kind of pivotal in the story of the other podcast, right? Of the Growth Mindset podcast. It wasn't until he asked his audience that he kind of found his, the kind of right move forward for the show. So yeah, really cool. On the back of that question, we got asked about how important is episode artwork? So is it worth doing, or what is it worth sticking just to the kind of podcast artwork? What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, this is so it's very clear that like Spotify is making big algorithmic moves here. Seems like nobody else is. I mean, YouTube, obviously, yes. Depending on how far down the YouTube rabbit hole you're going, that's a whole other topic. But it's clear that Spotify is, and so I think the more algorithmic podcast discovery becomes, the more that matters on episode artwork. Right now, podcasting is so. I tend to think of like podcasts traditionally kind of like a book, where like a big part of what you're buying into is the show premise and concept. And so it's like the cover art and the description of the show itself, and then the episodes are kind of nested under that as chapters. But like, and not every show is made like this, but I think great shows have a great concept that you don't need to see a single episode. You're just like, whoa, this show feels awesome. You just read the one sentence description of the show and you're like, great. And so a show that I came across just yesterday or 2 days ago is called Good One, and it's a show it's a show about comedy where in every episode a comedian comes on and they break down the process behind writing one of their jokes. And so they listen to how the joke is set up and they talk about what went into it. And it's like, that's a great premise for a show. Unfortunately, it's very inconsistent. Now that I've listened to a number of episodes, the format changes all the time, and there's a bunch of other stuff going on there. But the premise is really good, and I don't need to hear anybody on the guest list or any of the episodes look at the titles to know, like, yeah, I want to listen to this show. Other shows that don't have a great premise, I think, like, you're relying on episodes much more than the show as a whole. And I think that's much more how YouTube functions, where it's like, you might never go to the channel page of a YouTube creator, then you might have watched 50 of their videos because they get recommended to you. And so I think like that's more where algorithms will take us, where the show might matter less. I hope that's not true, because I love the show-driven nature of podcasts, and I think that will persist for a long time. But I do think that episode artwork will play a bigger role if and when that happens, which, I mean, it already is happening with Spotify. The degree of which, like, I would like it needs to be good, though. I think like that's the thing. Of you look at YouTubers who will spend like hours and hours and hours on their thumbnails, and so I do custom episode artwork because I'm already doing mine for YouTube, and it's a YouTube kind of first show, and so I would not do it. There's just no way I would dedicate that time if I wasn't also doing it for YouTube right now. So yeah, there's some nuance.
I was thinking that episode artwork could become like YouTube thumbnails, which is obviously a huge part of such a visual platform. That's really interesting to see if it does kind of go down that path. Cool. Another question that we've got. So are there any kind of common mistakes that you see podcasters often make with their artwork and branding that are easy to avoid?
I think like overcomplicating it. I think every amateur designer, and again, like I'm somebody who is self-taught design wise. Now I'm like pretty good, but I've made all the mistakes along the way. And amateur designers are so afraid of white space. You want to like cram a bunch of stuff in and it becomes really busy really quickly. And if you look at like what I would do, like this is what even professional designers are sometimes like, well, early professional designers are often scared to do this. But just like look at cover art you like and copy it. Like take the elements and don't like, copy it, but like look at like, oh, here's the layout that they've got going on. We're going to have different words. Maybe there's a different visual element, but like, let's emulate the structure of this cover art in some way. And looking at like, okay, what do I notice about the shows that I listen to? Probably they're really clean. They're really readable. The eye is being directed intentionally. We know we're not being given 10 different things to look at. It's like there's a visual hierarchy of like what draws the eye first and then like what's next. One of the other things, I didn't put the data in here, but the high growth shows tended to have they tend to be much more like text focused than graphic focused or photo focused, which is another interesting thing that like for most shows that I create for myself, partly because of my own like design limitations, I'll often do like cover and like big text with like some minor kind of like visual element where it's like you are not going to not be able to read it. And so that's really the biggest one is clarity. And then I think the other thing is like simplicity with color. And so really like think white, black, and one color is probably good, and even just one of those. And so it could be like some kind of neutral color, some kind of, primary color. If you are even a little more confident with design, maybe you have one more accent color, but like really limiting yourself in that regard, that's another kind of big mistake that a lot of shows go for. And really, yeah, I think like focus on clarity, focus on relevance. Like, does somebody looking at this on a small phone screen, can they tell what the show's about? Part of that comes down to what the title actually is, but then also that comes down to layout on the cover art.
Yeah, that's great advice. I was still thinking about the celebrity kind of faces versus like the typography. It makes so much sense for smaller podcasters. And then on that kind of subject of smaller, more niche shows, what is kind of like the most effective first step that they can take when tweaking podcast packaging? Should they start with artwork, the title, or something else? Yeah, entirely.
I would, yeah. So here's the test that I always do is you can do this a few ways, and you might want to experiment with how you frame the question. But if there's somebody that you come across who feels like they're not a listener of your show, but it feels like they should be, like they're in that demographic, and you can kind of say to them like, hey, have you ever heard of this show called, whatever your show name is? And you kind of like, don't say it's your show, just say like, hey, have you heard about this show so and so, and gauge their reaction. And if the title they're like, huh, like what's it about? And then if you give them just the description too, you're kind of one sentence pitch. And if you know that this person should be interested in the show, but if they're just kind of like, okay, maybe I'll check it out. It's like, okay, the title's not grabbing them, my description is not grabbing them. You could also like show them the cover art, and and if they look at that as well, they're like, oh, okay, I don't know. It's like, okay, we've got a pretty good indication that this person should be a listener, or they should at least be interested. They're not. We have some issue here. And you could actually then ask and follow up depending on your comfort level here and how brave you're feeling. Like, oh, like it doesn't seem like you're that interested. Like, is there anything in particular that's kind of like turning you off about it? And they're like, oh, yeah, I just like it doesn't really make sense to me. Like, what's the title doesn't make sense, or the cover art doesn't look that great. And so I'll often just like do that with people. It can be people in your kind of target demographic, or it can be people that you just like, whatever, you're at a party, you're at a meetup or something like that, and you just like ask the question and get your show in front of people and get first reactions. But the key thing here is not to tell them it's your show, because people will be nice and then they'll lie to you and they'll say, oh yeah, this like looks great, I'm definitely going to listen to this, and they are not going to do it. And sometimes if they're not in your target listenership, that doesn't really matter if it's a really niche show. But that's where I would start to try and diagnose what the issues are. And then if there is a title problem, you want to address that before you do the cover art, because that's kind of the big part of the cover art, is like communicating what the show is. And then I would move on to, show description. If there's, sometimes or even more, like the concept needs to be revisited entirely in the format of the show. So, but yeah, I would often start with the title. That's the thing that 100% everybody's going to see and engage with and be recommended. And so I think that's the highest leverage kind of point.
Yeah, that's interesting. I'm wondering, when you changed the title on the Growth Mindset show, did you kind of include the psychology when you were introing the podcast and talking about it like in the audio? How did that work?
I don't think he did. I think that was a subtle change that he rolled out. And I should ask him if he did any kind of update episode. I don't think he did. I think that was kind of like just something he'd been wanting to do for a while. And people who listened to the show already kind of knew the vibe, and it was more directed at people who were, coming in and experiencing it for the first time.
Okay, cool. Interesting. Yeah. I think because titles are such important kind of metadata as well, especially in podcast platforms, you've got to get that right. And what I know you've mentioned a couple of things that were surprising in terms of the data and the outcomes of the growth mindset project. Was there any other kind of bits of data that will stand out or surprising that you didn't expect from kind of just changing the artwork?
Let's see. Other surprising things. I mean, the reactivation of listeners or followers in Apple Podcasts, that was a really surprising one, that it wasn't just new people coming back in. I think I kind of mentioned most of them here, but like how Spotify is so much more algorithmically and suggestion kind of driven than Apple. And so his show didn't actually take that big a hit in Apple when he did the initial artwork. It was just kind of like very steadily kind of like increasing and kind of maybe plateaued a bit there. But with Spotify, it just spiked and dropped down. And so that's what's kind of interesting, is how different the platforms are. And that's something worth noting and thinking about. And really like when I think about packaging, I had somebody ask me the other day, like, how do you think about, like, should we be thinking about specifically Spotify in a different way? And really, I think like this is a somewhat simplistic statement, but like in general, algorithms are trying to serve people and act in a similar way to people. And so like the stuff that is going to attract somebody to click into your show is also going to help the algorithm do better. So if it looks more legitimate, more professional, it stands out against, the other shows, like all those things, they work on people and just from a psychological perspective, and they also work on the algorithm, because essentially the algorithm is recommending stuff that then people click into. And so if people are going to click into it, like then the algorithm is going to reward more of that. So that I don't think there's like, even though the platforms are different, I think operating as if we do have, we do have this algorithm in Spotify, I think that will benefit all platforms, which is kind of what we saw with his the show did grow on every platform after the change.
I think that's what we do. We do sometimes lose sight of sometimes that it is humans at the end of it. We're not, you can kind of get lost in the marketing, right? We've got one more question and then we can move on to the giveaway. So Amy has asked, if we have a podcast website, should the podcast artwork colors coordinate with the site, or can the podcast artwork be independent?
Sorry, can you repeat that? I was getting distracted by Sam's actually here and chiming in the chat. Everybody reach out to Sam, listen to his show as well.
Hi, Sam. If we also, Amy asked if they have a podcast website and should the podcast artwork and branding coordinate with the site, or can it be independent?
Yeah, I think it depends on your brand. I'm somewhat torn on this because I have sometimes I'll come up with, a design kind of concept for a brand, and then I'll come up with like a podcast or a newsletter or something that just doesn't feel like it wants to be. It feels like it, from a design perspective, it wants to be something else. And sometimes it's actually like, I feel like with my newsletter, Scrappy Podcasting, it actually sometimes works in reverse, where it's like, okay, I figured out, I didn't know what I had a general branding for Podcast Marketing Academy. And then I had got really specific and kind of more spiky and unique and interesting with Scrappy Podcasting over the past kind of 6 or 9 months. I did a visual refresh. And then that clued me into like, oh, now I understand how I can work those assets back into the rest of the brand. And so I generally stick to the same color palette across everything I do. There are some kind of elements I try to incorporate regularly so they do feel like they belong together. But there's some things that, like, I'm currently for these, this is like the dumbest thing. Like, speaking of packaging, so my co-host Justin and I, we have this podcast roast show. It's just on YouTube. It has no name. I call it Roast My Podcast because that's, I think, going to be the name of the show. But it's not an actual podcast right now. It's just a YouTube channel. And the only reason is because I don't have cover art for it. I've like set up the feed, I've loaded up a bunch of episodes, and I have a design concept that I made such a horrible, speaking of like childlike, it is just abysmal, the design that I came up with. And so now I'm trying to find a designer to do it. But that design angle for that, I'm like, this does not feel like it's in alignment with the rest of my brand, but it does feel like it's in what I want to communicate about the show. And so I'm a little bit curious how that's going to turn out. I'm talking with a designer now, and we'll see. But that one could be totally different. And yeah, so I think there's ideally it is kind of all aligned, but there may be cases where it's not.
Okay, great. Everyone needs to stay tuned to see how that turns out and see you follow your own advice, Jeremy. Great. Well, thank you so much. That was so insightful. I certainly learned a lot, and I know the chat was going off, and it's great to have Sam here as well from the Growth Mindset podcast. So thanks for joining, Sam. We do have the winners of the giveaway right now. So I will announce them. This is the first time I'm announcing winners of a contest. I expected to have like drum rolls and stuff, but unfortunately I don't. But the 3 winners are Anita Normanley, Julie York, and Adam Gray. So you will be winning the there's 3 P's in this, and I always get them mixed around. So it is the perfect podcast packaging workshop from Jeremy. So yeah, we'll get that sent out to you. And well done. And thanks everyone for joining. And thank you so much, Jeremy. That was awesome. And yeah we will follow up with all the details. We'll follow up with all the details and the case studies and stuff that Jeremy mentioned in his channels and where you can find him. And yeah, we'll see you on the next one next month. So thanks, everyone.
Thanks, everyone.
Bye.